Oh, I thought you were
A very
back.
warm welcome to you all to this, the 2024 Charles Holden Lecture. My name is Andrew Nash. I'm based in the Institute of English Studies, and I'm here tonight in my role as chair of the Friends of Senate House Library. The Holden Lecture, which is organised by the Friends of Senate House Library, traditionally takes as its focus one of the library's unique research collections. And this year, the focus is on the library's Caribbean collections, which are the subject of a wonderful new exhibition entitled In the Grip of Change, the Caribbean and its British Diaspora, which has been curated by Juanita Cox of the Institute of Historical Research and Agda Rublak of Senate House Library. The exhibition runs until the 28th of March next year, and I do urge you to make the visit to the fourth floor of the library, of this building, the entrance floor of the library, and enjoy this beautifully crafted display. There will be monthly tours led by the curators, which can be booked through the Senate House Library website, and we'll share all these details with you after this evening's event. The event this evening comes at an exciting moment for Senate House Library, which is about to embark on an exciting plan which it's calling The Next Chapter. This is an ambitious plan to open up a new digital and physical home for study and exchange, which will transform the library into a world-leading beacon for research, understanding, and community engagement. And as our closest friends, we're naturally keen to involve you in helping us to shape the next chapter. So we'll be sharing more details about these plans in the Friends newsletters in the months to come. Before introducing our speaker this evening, I'd just like to remind you that the lecture is being recorded and it will be shared after the event on the university's website. And because the lecture is being filmed centrally, we do ask you not to record it onto your own devices. If you do have any concerns about the filming, please speak with one of my colleagues at the registration desk. Well, now it gives me great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Alison Donnell. Alison is the head of the School of Humanities and Professor of Modern Literatures in English at the University of Bristol. She previously held head of school posts at the University of Reading and at the University of East Anglia. Alison boasts a wide and distinguished portfolio of published research and funded research projects. She's written extensively on Anglophone Caribbean literature and on Caribbean gender and queer studies. Her latest monograph, Creolized Sexualities, Undoing Heteronormativity in the Literary Imagination of the Anglo-Caribbean, was published by Rutgers University Press in 2022. And she was general editor of the multi-volume series Caribbean Literature in Transition, 1880 to 2020, which appeared from Cambridge University Press in 2020. So, very up-to-date volume indeed. Alison has an ongoing commitment to exploring and expanding literary histories of the Caribbean. Her Caribbean Literary Heritage Project, which was funded by the Leverhulme Trust, can be explored online in a wonderful website. And a new publication entitled Lost and Found, A to Z of Neglected Writers from the English-speaking Caribbean, will be published next year. She is, as you might imagine, in hot demand as a lecturer internationally. She's delivered the National Library of Jamaica's annual Distinguished Lecture, the annual Edward Boyle Lecture at the University of the West Indies, and in 2024 delivered the University of Guyana's Edgar Mittelholzer Memorial Lecture. So we're very lucky to have been able to lure her here tonight. And she's going to be talking about a new project that she is working on, topic of her lecture, which relates to the, in some ways I think, to the exhibition that we have on upstairs, in a lecture entitled Careless Whispers and Broken Records, How We Lost Mid-Century Caribbean Women Writers. Please join me in welcoming Professor Alison Donnell as she delivers the 2024 Charles Holden Lecture.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for inviting me tonight. Thank you to the Friends of the Library, to the library staff, to Anita and Cox and Argila Rublack for the amazing exhibition, which I spent some happy time in this afternoon. And thank you to many of my friends and former students who are here tonight. I really welcome your support. I'm honoured to give this lecture, in part to be part of a tradition honouring Senate House Library and honouring libraries as vital knowledge institutions and sites of educational transformation. Giving tonight's lecture made me reflect on how libraries have been essential to my career as an academic and also as a Caribbeanist. I'll just share with you. So in the middle was the library in Kersley, Coventry, where I would make weekly trips with my mother and sister, which was my gateway to the world of books. Typical of most middle-class aspiring households in the 1960s, my parents were interested in education and owned encyclopedia, as well as housekeeping and gardening books. The book I remember best, probably for its smell, was the oil-stained, crinkled-paged Haynes Manual from my mother's fabulously stylish and evidently rotting Triumph 1500 that I would read aloud as my father was under the car cursing on a Sunday morning. I loved books from the get-go. My sister was 4 years older than me, and having taught me to read at the age of 3.5, she showed me how to use our bedside camping lights to read under the sheets. Although she had me reading my way through Thomas Hardy at 12, I became literary smart relatively late in life, having initially decided on medicine as my professional path. My next significant library was a rather glorious one in the middle here, at Atlantic College, a United World College on the Welsh coast where I studied for the International Baccalaureate, in an extraordinary cohort of peers from truly all around the world. Switching from physics to English in my final year, fully beguiled and persuaded by the power of books and the inspirational teaching of Catherine Jones, I read Athol Fugard alongside John Keats, Malkraj Anand alongside Alexander Solzhenitsyn, my friends and dorm mates, but also my reading and the books of that gorgeous library opened to me a rich plurality of lives and perspectives. One of the filming venues for Harry Potter movies, the Castle Library, looked like that of an Oxbridge college, to which most of my peers headed, while I defiantly turned back to the 1960s architecture of the Midlands. At Warwick University, which is the library on the far side, I took a course in Caribbean literature taught by the extraordinary Guyanese critic and writer Michael Gills, and then another by the equally exceptional Guyanese critic and writer David Daberdeen, who I know was here a couple of nights ago. With the Centre for Caribbean Studies at Warwick, the library holdings were immensely rich pickings for me, and I can still recall my first full shiver of scholarly rapture when it was suggested to me by David that I consult the catalogue of the West India Reference Library, and that's this 6-volume catalogue here in the middle. Unimaginable to me then that 30 years later I would deliver their annual lecture in the very building to which the catalogue referred. In many ways, tonight's lecture, the research project that came before it and the book that will be published in April have their roots in my doctoral research at the Centre for Caribbean Studies. I was fortunate to have access to the most brilliant library of primary and secondary sources, including little magazines and pamphlets. And as I daytime camped amongst the more or less empty stacks of the third floor corner, it didn't take me long to realise that the idea of Caribbean literature that was circulated via metropolitan publishers and higher education reading lists was just the teeniest, tiniest fraction of what we might actually read, teach, and discuss. What I wanted to find a way to express then, and what has driven all my work since, is that mismatch between what's circulated and critiqued and what more fully constitutes the substance of the field. Although the dominant version or the canon of Caribbean literature has shifted over time as the conditions in which it's been fashioned and affirmed have changed very profoundly, Those writers and writings that were initially lost to literary history have not generally found a way back in. And so it's probably worth saying that the writers that I'm going to discuss tonight in some detail had not been mentioned in any literary histories or studies, and nobody I know working in the field has read their work other than on my request. Indeed, even as the publishing and prominence of Caribbean literature has expanded exponentially in the last 2 decades, I've been struck by how partial the accounts remain. And most of all, I continue to be preoccupied with what we miss, with what eludes us. As I slowly built my academic career, I continued to collect second-hand books by Caribbean women and mid-century writers when I could, and to amass a collection of photocopies and then digital photos from visits to specialist repositories. And a big shout out here to the Elmer Jordan Library in Trinidad, which has an amazing collection and wonderful collections professionals. It was not unusual for me to come across a short work by a woman writer, but to have little or absolutely no sense of her life, to know where she came from, how she fitted into the literary, social, or political histories. I kept lists of names and publications in Word documents to which I would add any biographical or bibliographical details as I discovered these. I migrated these slowly emerging histories from floppy disk to pen drives across different institutional servers, careful not to lose my inventory of what I comically, if ironically, noted as seemingly lost. I did actually once suggest to my husband that I had a filing cabinet with a file with each of their names on, but that one didn't happen. When I was granted funding for a major project from the Leverhulme Trust in 2016, and I'll just again put this slide up here, my quest to bring further attention to those mid-century writers was, and most particularly to look for the women, was suddenly more possible. Funding gave me money and time to read in Caribbean libraries and archives, and a team of interested and committed interlocutors, the dream ticket for any humanities scholar. And I really want to thank the Leverhulme Trust for that funding, and also the incredible Digital Library of the Caribbean that published the findings via its open access library press. And if any of you don't know the Digital Library of the Caribbean, do look it up. It's a tremendous institution. So in the last 8 years, I've begun to recover very many of the mid-century writers in more detail, to write Facebook entries, academic papers and articles, and in a handful of cases to work with their families, to understand the richness of their life stories, research their private papers. Yet in terms of thinking about this work of recovery research, as a critic, I've not only been interested to find out who the women are, what they wrote and what they bring to an expanded literary history, but intent on thinking about how we lost them. As I hope to show, what surfaces in answering this problem is a cluster of political contexts, favoured literary forms and gendered prejudices that validated particular conjunctions of nation and narration, looking to the novel form and emblematic stories with critical insights around belonging and migration, alongside an obstinate disregard of the possibility of professional female authorship. The collective impact of these are broken records of Caribbean literary history, both in terms of an almost complete disconnect back to that richer, fuller, more diverse literary field, and in terms of versions of that history that are played over and over again. The first version is the familiar story of a sudden boom of male migrant writing in 1950s London. As George Lamming, the famous Barbadian writer, described it, this decade, to quote, witnessed the emergence of the novel as an imaginative interpretation of West Indian society by West Indians. The second broken record is the vibrant blossoming of women's writing in 1980s Jamaica with Erna Brockburn, Lorna Godison, Olive Senior and others, as a moment that shifted critical and creative attention towards women writers. There is nothing inaccurate in these accounts, but there is much unseen. And the story of that wondrous generation as the story of Caribbean literary emergence has convincingly written over the possibility of women's writing from the earlier period. I was taught that broken record, and most scholars, even specialists, remain unaware of the extent and the nature of the loss it conceals. Indeed, given how confidently and consistently the women are left out, I'm just going to show you the scale of the loss. And these are the writers, these don't include the writers that I have worked on and written about. So here we have a list of the women writers who were broadcast on the BBC Caribbean Voices programme between 1945 and 58. Here we have a list of the women writers who were published in the Barbadian magazine Bin, and another list of the women writers who were published in the Beacon. And then we have a list of the women writers who were published in Kaikoura L and in Jamaica. So we're not talking about a small number of writers here. How could these women go unseen for so long? Location certainly played a role, with proximity to London and its literary networks being particularly important for entry into the circle of long-standing recognition. Just before he died in 1955, the Jamaican novelist Roger Mace described the Caribbean writer as, to quote, essentially a travelling, gambling man with a manuscript or two in his bag and a big dream of contributing to contemporary English literature. Articulating the conjunction of migration, masculinity, and authorship that came to define that mid-century Caribbean boom, as well as that aspiration to be recognised by the literary metropole. The arrival in England of a number of significant male novelists, Edgar Mittelholzer, Roger Mace, Vic Reeve, John Hearn, and Andrew Solke, as well as the soon towering figures of V.S. Naipaul, George Lamming, Wilson Harris, and Sam Salvon, was by the 1960s to give shape to an enduring West Indian canon. Of course, I have found women writers in London at this time, indeed, at the University of London at this time. So it's not the whole story of neglect, but it was the story that was anthologized and circulated. So if you see here, we've got 6 collections of Caribbean writing that came out between 1965 and 1967. Not one of these collections presents the writing of an Anglophone Caribbean woman writer. In some ways, the blanket omission cast by that mid-century may explain the subsequent neglect, with attention simply being routed to where it has been concentrated before, as in Shevchenko's Law of the Dog and the Forest, which emblematizes the tendency of historians to repeat the tracks of previous historians rather than venturing further afield. Just as the allegorical dog who chooses a tree to mark without any sense of its relative significance establishes the path for future dogs, so these early critics and anthologists generated a narrow inventory of writers published by major English publishing houses who were known to them, which others with the opportunity to record or replicate the field simply followed. Yet, alongside that more innocent explanation, what begins to express itself here, and what I believe is deeply entangled with the myth of mid-century emergence of male writing, is another broken record, or that I think emerges around the same time. And this is around the development of the Caribbean literary tradition through metropolitan publishing houses, and mainly the novel form, Walcott's poetry being the exception. Attention to writers such as Naipaul and Salvon, who are likened to Dickens and Eliot in their style when they're received, further drew attention away from an array of creative works that were written in, about, and for the Caribbean region. And the separation of literature from writing, as these commonly vernacular and local writings were framed and published, became clear. They were published as being of cultural value, as being of educational value within the nation-making project, but a separation between that and literary value. As generations of literary critics dutifully followed the sense made by the slender trails of metropolitan and academic presses, perhaps it simply did not occur to them to look to local imprints, local newspapers, or Nelson School's anthologies for creative work about which to write their articles or teach their courses. Yet, trained as a post-colonialist, while I can see the draw of the narrowly carved track, I can't ignore the neglect of local writings and vernacular writings as part of a much broader delegitimation of knowledge of certain communities, including colonised people, indigenous people, people from peripheral geographies. Aware that the lack of acknowledgement for this kind of knowledge and the lack of care for its futurity, its historical place, has been theorised as epistemic injustice or erasure by Miranda Fricker, or as white ignorance by Charles W. Mills. As a feminist also, while I can appreciate the compelling and brilliant talents of those male writers, whom I genuinely love reading, I can't ignore the subtle and blatant diminishment of women writers at the time and the persistently gendered idea of women's writing, which I'll come on to. And as a literary critic, while I too enjoy immersing myself in the novels of the period, I'm alert to the diminution of the multitude of dazzling short stories and the dismissal of this genre as a literary form that can support a writing career. Some of you may know that Diana Attell insisted that Naipaul publish a novel when he wanted to publish short stories. If he wanted to be a writer, he had to publish a novel. Materialist concerns are obviously also at play in the lost and unseen nature of many writers who remained in the Caribbean region, as one of the legacies of empire was the absence of literary infrastructure at home, publishers, agents, etc., and the push to the idea of the imperial centre as the location of culture proper, including literary culture. And so it was that these vectors of privilege, of literary preference, and of prejudice converged variously on the rich and usually overlapping traditions of mid-century local writings and mid-century women's writings, which fell into obscurity, and the record of a busy, vibrant, diverse culture of storytelling and writing became virtually unseen. So what I'm arguing here really is that the broken records that have continued to play around there being no women's writing of that period, and around local writings not really being literary writings, has led to the overlooking of an entire parallel mid-century literary tradition. This is a history of shaping the nation at home, through writing, storytelling, journalism, school books, drama competitions. This is a history in which rich oral and folk cultures found articulation and validation without the primary consideration of commercial return or metropolitan endorsement. To me, this is not a minor literary history, even though it remains an almost completely concealed and neglected one. Thankfully, none of the material constraints of that time or the narratives of silence that took root subsequently limited the ambitions of these other mid-century writers or the quality of their writings. And while I've been writing and editing this A to Z, and you'll see this is just a selection. In a way, I did the A to Z to show how random it was, how many writers there were, we could sift through in many ways, to enable a surfacing of this tradition more in the round. Tonight, I'm just going to discuss two remarkable spirited women writers who remained unfound in very different circumstances. For Edwina Melville and Monica Skeet, the project of writing creatively was intimately connected to building localised imaginaries and in closing the gap between the everyday lived reality of Caribbean places and people and the world of the literary. Publishing in local venues and often explicitly directing their writings towards children, these writers saw the value of their work as embedded in Caribbean communities, building an appreciation of the region's distinctive cultural resources and lived realities. And here I just want to acknowledge the assistance and the support of the families in the research, especially Tondele Simone and Myrna Martineau, who thankfully acted as librarians of their mother and aunt's papers, never anticipating but warmly welcoming my curiosity and becoming keen members of my literary detective agency. So to come on to Edwina, these are the things: unknown, isolated, excluded. I first heard the name Edwina Melville from Henry Swansea, the producer of the now infamous BBC Caribbean Voices programme in the 1950s, which helped to launch the careers of Naipaul and Walcott, and with whom I corresponded in the early 1990s, when I was writing letters to anyone and everyone I thought who might be able to tell me about the missing women. I asked Mr. Swansea which women writers he thought I should follow up on, and Edwina was given special attention. When I won the Leverhulme funding, I went back to my letters and then to the BBC archives, and I found that Melville had 4 short pieces broadcast on the BBC between 1953 and 1955. And when I read the scripts, I was genuinely bowled over. She is the most tremendous writer. Her writing was rooted in the specificity of its place, so sensitive to the environment, so compassionate and inclusive in its imaginings. It has a really ecological sensibility, and it characterises a very mixed population living in proximity, switching between Standard English, Guyanese Creole and Wahashona. How had I never seen her in print? Who was she? I have no idea. Now I know so much about Edwina Melville. You can see down here with the pet jaguar living in the Rupununi, a Guyanese journalist, writer, politician. She was born Edwina Gordon in 1926, educated in Georgetown at Bishop's High School and apprenticed to journalism at the Guyana Chronicle. She relocated to the Latham region of Rupununi. That's right on the Brazilian border, as far away from Georgetown as you can get. Even now it's 12 hours drive. So in 1950, it was a couple of days. She married Charles Melville. She had 5 children of her own and raised many more, becoming a member of the Guyanese Parliament in 1983 and continuing to work tirelessly for her community until her death in 1993. But my introduction to Edwina, in a letter from Henry Swansea in 1990, gave a slightly different impression. He said, "Far away on the high savannas of the Rupununi in Guyana, there was a particular favourite of mine, a girl called Edwina Melville, who was the only writer to send material direct to London. I often wonder what happened to her. She was married to the Melville clan on the borders of Venezuela, against whom Forbes Burnham sent 3 planeloads of troops to smoke them out." Swansea's admiration and affection for Edwina is not in question. All the same, his mention of this formidable woman who would routinely kill the snakes falling on her bed and who was the first woman in Guyana to have a tractor license as a girl and married to the Melville clan casts her in domestic frame and diminishes the idea of her as a serious writer. His wistful remark about "I wonder what happened to her" suggests he anticipated that her writing career would be transient, impossible to sustain. Piecing together the parts of Edwina's correspondence held in the written archives in Caversham and the West Indiana Special Collection in Trinidad reveals that Edwina made it plain to Swansea that she had serious ambitions as a writer. In her first letter to him, she asked if he will accept a longer piece in 2 parts about her wild life, True. And in a later letter, Swansea refers to her magnus opus, evidently picking up on a conversation about a longer work. Edwina's first story, Fishing in the Rupununi Savannah, British Guyana, was broadcast in 1953 and relates a fishing trip rich in local detail. But the narrative's also interested in sketching the relationship between a husband and wife. A strong sense of women's yearning to participate in a world beyond the home, to engage equally with men in the pleasures of the land and the thrill of adventure. Although in 1954 Swansea returns her poem suggesting she needs to work in her technique, he also tells her that she needs to do nothing more than to, quote, her racy prose. On the 18th of June 1954, this is the year he leaves the programme. We now know that Swansea whispered into his diary, which has only very recently been published by Papillote Press. Gloria Vaz reads the sketch, The Voice by Edwina Melville, describing the reception of one of her broadcast stories on the lonely ranch and Pranza on the remote Ripponini Plateau. True art, if artless. I sent the script to London Calling. It is the most vivid thing I have ever seen on the General Service overseas. So here we have the very man who's been credited by the likes of Kamal Brathwaite and George Lamming for his pivotal role in the creation of Anglophone Caribbean literature, identifying Edwina's writing as the most vivid thing. Swansea kept the photograph of Edwina on the water buffalo with her twin children in his so-called ego book. And that year, her exquisite story, The Voice, was published on the front cover of the BBC London Calling magazine. Because of the broken nature of the historical records about these women writers, researching beyond the library has been critical, and my methods have included newspaper ads and even TV ads. But they've yielded wonderful results. As one of the newspaper ads, I contacted Edwina's family, and through access to her private papers, that's just a little insight into what it's been like working with her private papers, I was able to read some of her letters, which give the other side of Swansea's view. Her papers have, like Edwina herself, been through difficult journeys, but like her, they still sparkle. So this is research in Ann Arbor, where her daughter lives, where I literally kind of lived and slept with her papers. And this is in Letham when I visited, and this is her daughter reading the story, The Voice, to the rest of the family. So in a letter to her sisters, Edwina shares her excitement at this publication. She says, "Have you by any chance seen my story reproduced in London Calling? I don't know if they'll pay for it. She's very worried about money. I think it's just a big honour when they use a person's stuff. Anyway, Mrs. Lindo wrote and congratulated me and said it's only the second time in all the history of the Caribbean Voices programme that a contributor's work has been used, and she is so proud." Yes, and a letter from Mr. Swansea. Well, I have to treasure that letter to my heart. He said, and now I'll reveal what he said, "Dear Mrs. Melville, I hope you will be pleased by seeing what has become of your script. Don't imagine, I implore you, that it has set the Thames on fire and that you must come at once to London to follow it up. But it is a pleasant success, all the same. I hope others will come to you in future. Yours sincerely, Henry Swansea." Publishing her story in the magazine was an important gesture of support, but of a different order to the unofficial agency work that Swansea undertook for many of the mid-century male writers. And Swansea's warning to Edwina not to imagine herself a writer of metropolitan note echoes those broken records of local writing and women's writing being of a different order. I couldn't help but notice that Swansea's diary for the next day records him having lunch with Samuel Selborne. So while Edwina is at pains to show Swansea how serious she is about writing, despite her immensely challenging domestic circumstances, his sense of what is an achievement for her sets limitations around her writing life and her subsequent visibility. Sure enough, his sense of Edwina as very much a woman writer becomes clear when she asks him for advice. He suggests that she sends her work to some of the women's papers like Queen or Good Housekeeping, whom he believes will be interested to hear about your daily life as a woman in a remote place. It's both enraging and shocking to think that the writer, this highly lauded facilitator, identified as the most vivid, has remained completely unseen to literary histories. While Edwina was thrilled at his letter, I could quietly scream at his careless, private whisper, a recognition of literary brilliance that he failed to translate into meaningful support for professional authorship, even though he knew what that looked like. Another act of unseeing was to take place in Guyanese literary history. In 1960, the year after Wilson Harris left for England to pursue his career as a writer, A.J. Seymour, the main literary facilitator in Guyana, published a piece called From Raleigh to Carew, the Books of Guyana, in his little magazine, Kike Overall. The piece answers his own question: what is the range of volumes in the Guyana bookshelf? How shall we value our heritage? Seymour turns to consider the male administrators and political leaders alongside the writers we may expect to find, from Martin Carter to Jan Carew. It's only when he turns at the end of the piece to consider the lack of children's books that some women's names appear. West Indian fairy tales by Gertrude Shaw, Celeste Dolphins broadcast to schools. These are the only women writers he mentions, and there is no sense of a possible overlap for him between the writers whose works are of literary value and those whose works are of educational value. There is also no mention here of Edwina, even though by 1960 she's had 4 pieces broadcast from London on the Caribbean Voices programme. And other Guyanese writers, Jan Carew, Martin Carter, Wilson Harris, Edgar Mittelholzer, Dennis Williams, as well as Seymour himself, have also been broadcast on that programme. And I'm pretty sure we're listening to it. So it seems highly unlikely that her radio work was not known in some way to literary Guyana. More than this, she'd actually published 2 pieces in Seymour's own little magazine, Kike Overall. So some other form of broken record is undeniable there. Yet despite that denial, Edwina did happily manage to sustain her writing career. She did not take the steps Swansea recommended for her. I searched for Edwina's writings in these women's papers without luck, but when an eBay search came up with a story published under her name called The Waiting Land, I had another lead. The story arrived as a literary orphan, cut from its binding by eBay merchants indifferent to its value in literary history. It was from the esteemed Literary Blackwoods magazine, a venue recognised for supporting serious literary talent from 1817, and interestingly, a magazine with a preference for publishing non-metropolitan works. Fortunately, Blackwoods magazine has been beautifully archived and preserved in the National Library of Scotland, and with the wonderful assistance of Kirsty McHugh, the curator, I was able to trace Edwina's subsequent authorship adventures in the 50s and 60s through her correspondence with Commander Blackwood. I discovered that just weeks after she sends her story The Waiting Land to Blackwood in 1955, so not long after Swansea's told her to send it to Good Housekeeping, he writes back and asks her what prompted the story of a visit to the Rupununi. In her reply, Edwina shares a defining moment when telling him how she made a visit to her brother Tom, who was working for the Rupununi Development Company based in Warrawal Outstation in 1949. She says, all my life I heard fabulous stories about the Rupununi, and so when I had the opportunity to actually visit the place, I was overjoyed. I grew to love the place so much during that brief year that it was only natural that I should find my husband there. She adds in her vivacious, guileless manner, I hope one day to break into the literary world with a bestseller full of stories about the country and its people, ensuring that he too is aware of her literary ambition. I won't give you all the details today, but she publishes other works with him. He rejects, we know, unlike the BBC archives, we have the record that he rejects some of her pieces, but always writing favourably to her, encourages her to get an agent, and she continues to send work to him. He's a rather buttoned-up Scotsman who chooses not to comment on the personal circumstances that she enthusiastically shares with him, but he obviously is keen to have her writing. And in 1964, she receives a piece of news that she tells him has amazed and stunned her with joy. Her story, The Girl in Green, has won second prize in the Blackwood Prize Competition of 1964. Here, then, was a mid-century Caribbean woman writer writing with talent and charm about exactly the kind of Caribbean world that was being celebrated in London. But it turns out that Commander Blackwood, whom I've been cheering throughout my time in the Edinburgh Library, is also prone to careless whispers. He says, "I have noted that you don't want to give your name to this story, and I agree with that. I think it's better that readers are not told it's written by a lady. I prefer we use the initials EM. The story appears as he wishes, and Edwina is paid £40. It is perhaps enough to reflect on her authorial achievements up to this point, to consider what it means for Edwina and for us as literary critics to know that her creative flair and aptitude have been recognised and affirmed within institutions that are known to have made careers so widely celebrated today, and yet at the same time to be kept at bay, and ultimately to have her name unspoken, concealed. The next decade creates a huge chasm in her life. And obviously this was a big limitation on her achieving professional authorship. During the Rupununi Rebellion of January 1969, she has to flee with her family to Brazil. And until they get permission to return to Guyana 4 years later, she effectively feels in exile and is making every effort to clear her name. All her writing energy goes into that. When she returns, she makes monumental efforts to relaunch her writing career with enormous humility as well as passion. But she only ever appears as an echo and more careless whispers by male publishers. Her very early writing, which she writes a letter to Seymour to say, "I don't know why you're publishing those poems I wrote when I was 16, here's all new work." He completely ignores that and keeps publishing her old material. And when she appears in the 1980 Treasury of Guyanese Poetry, it's still the work that was published in 1953. And in her biography for a 1986 publication, reads, "Edwina Melville, Guyanese journalist. She has published unusual love poems from the Rupununi." Presumably another careless record that erases all she had achieved as a writer in the intervening years. And I'll just show you her bibliography here. That's her poetry. It's her book, this is a Rupununi, is in the library here, so if you want to go and check it out, I encourage you to do so. This is her short fiction. And these are her broadcasts. So quite a considerable body of work. And also by then, she had been called to the National Assembly and sworn in as a Member of Parliament for Region 9. So not quite published unusual love poems. Bringing Melville's short stories back into literary history is a contribution to restoring the parallel alternative tradition focused on the domestic and the local, and the intricately human. And it offers important insights about other Caribbean literary aesthetic and ethic that was quietly in the making alongside the nationalist and often masculinist novels that we now identify with this period. In their careful rendering of the involved life of communities, her stories restore a fitting back history to the works of accomplished Caribbean short story writers such as Olive Senior and Lorna Goodison. They also constitute an as yet unseen tradition alongside other women writers included in the A to Z, including Vera Bell, Dorothy Lovell, Eula Redhead, and Ada Quayle, Kathleen Robinson. So pseudonyms is another reason why we find it hard to find the writers. As I hinted earlier, the idea of the mid-century woman writer as unseen because they lived remote Caribbean lives is not the whole story. And like Edwina Melville, Monica Skeet's life and published works do align with many of the characteristics that we now associate with the Windrush generation. And yet she too has entirely faded from view within the critical landscape. Monica Martineau, as she was then, was born in Grenville, Grenada in 1923, so a peer of Edwina. And she joined her father in Barbados at the age of 15 to be educated at the prestigious Queen's College. Her father, James Martineau, was a prosperous black entrepreneur and a key sponsor of the Barbados Progressive League, which became the Barbados Labour Party. And the Barbados Workers' Union was founded in 1941 in Martineau House, in her family home. So Monica no doubt heard lively conversations about democracy, rights, concerns of the working class, themes that infuse her literary works. But after graduating from the elite and predominantly white Queen's College in 1942, she started her teaching career, first in Grenada and then going back to teach at her alma mater. And this is a picture, you can see the staff, and Monica is in there. In 1955, she sailed for England to study for a postgraduate diploma in education and then for a BA honours in history at King's College, University of London. She may even have walked in this very space. Monica was partly inspired to migrate by her romantic attachment to Harry Skeet, who'd left Barbados to study in London too. And they married while they were here and then returned to Barbados in '64, where Monica took up a post as a history teacher at Queen's College, a role that she stayed in until she retired in 1983. Now, Skeet's first prose work, The Scholarship, was broadcast on the Caribbean Voices programme too in 1958. It's a charming and vivid story of Sonny Boy, who's been selected for individual coaching for the scholarship exam. And it relates how the expectations of his teachers and his family have stripped Sonny of all the small pleasures of his life, loaded him with the burden of pride and reputation. While Sonny's success rewards the efforts of all involved, he questions why he has to write about subjects in the exam that have no bearing whatsoever to his life. And this is a theme that resonates through Skeet's writing about the connections between Caribbean lives and Caribbean classrooms, her own material finding its way from her experience in the Caribbean classroom, but never, as far as I know, finding its way back into her classroom. So the scholarship has been reprinted in multiple anthologies. It actually is hiding in plain sight. But all of these are anthologies for school and for sort of lower school. In the increasingly hardened separation of literary and educational works, her stories have never, ever been picked up by literary critics. So when her first story was broadcast, there was a little news story in the Daily Gleaner in Jamaica, which carried a catchy title, From Queen's to King's College, referring from her going from Queen's College in Barbados to King's College in London. More careless whispers. So the journalist says, when she isn't studying, Monica looks after her husband, Harry. And just for good measure, writes the odd ode and occasional short story. The presentation of her writing as a secondary activity to her wifely duties and her studies gives us some indication of the prejudices against her as a woman writer that likely contracted the support for her pursuing ambitious pathways to professional authorship, just as it did for Edwina, married to the Melville clan. In 1960, she too wins a prize in Barbados for a lovely short story called The Return. And although only 4 pages long, the story of Ruby and her sister Dovey beautifully explores the inner expanses of a diasporic life. When Ruby returns home to Barbados at the age of 52, having left at 12, she must confront how she had allowed herself to romanticize home, forgetting the children without shoes, the coronation portraits, and the poverty that were the reality of her family. When the published version of this story appeared in a 1960 edition of the important literary magazine Bin, Frank Collymore, the editor, a pal of Swansea's and a celebrated literary facilitator of literary reputations, refers to her as a short story writer of great promise. Further recognition of her role in Bajan literary culture can be found in a biographical note in Sabaku, where Kamau Brathwaite, a now towering figure of the Caribbean literary tradition, refers to her as one of the cornerstones. 3 cheers for these call-outs, and yet. In his renowned 1974 article, The African Presence in Caribbean Literature, Brathwaite's appreciation of Skeat's work is carelessly whispered away. He chooses her poem, published in Sabaku, as his first example of this African presence, noting how her language and technique are exemplary in connecting with and validating the submerged vernacular folk traditions. But hers is the only writer's name that he fails to include in the body of his work. So while he raises her up as part of his own argument for African cultural restitution in the Caribbean, he carelessly whispers her name and contributes to the muted nature of her literary acknowledgement. Like Edwina, her identity as a writer is somehow secreted. The most notable milestone in Skeat's writing career came when her collection of stories, Time Out, was published by Thomas Nelson and Sons in 1978 as part of their Authors for the Caribbean educational series. And although the combination of educational and literary careers is really not uncommon, in fact, Collymore himself was both teacher and editor, the seeming separateness of these worlds for Skeat is intriguing. There is no recognition within Queen's College star files, event programmes, or yearbooks of Skeat's accomplishments as a writer. And the privileged and overwhelmingly white, for most of her career, environment of the school doesn't connect at all in the world of her literary imagination, which centres on black working class Bajans with a particular focus on women and children. Skeat's stories, which I plan to republish with Papillote Press next year, can be really beautifully read alongside those of Landing and Selvon in theme and in form. And if it were not for the distance set between them by the production and marketing strategies of educational and literary publishers, her stories would likely have been enjoyed by Caribbean adult readers and discussed by literary critics in the same way. And I'll just show you her. This is the Queen's College archive, which I explored with a lot of pleasure. And this is the Careless Whisper by Brathwaite. So aside from that careless whisper, and, thinking that Brathwaite's strong affirmation would have brought her writing to attention, I think the most significant reason for her neglect is that she only remains in print in these textbooks, and they have just not been regarded as suitable sources for literary critics. And also a lot of bibliographic projects, which is relevant in the context of a library, have not catalogued writing for children or educational writing as part of a Caribbean literary tradition. So to conclude, what this research has taught me most profoundly is that Caribbean women writers of mid-century are not lost, even though very many remain unfound. They are clandestine in treasured family or private collections, camouflaged amid the archives of non-Caribbean publications like Blackwood's magazine, as yet unearthed from the recently discoverable large data sets of newspaper libraries, as well as hiding in plain sight in publishers' lists alongside writers we already know, like Kathleen Robinson, Ada Quayle, who was published by the same publisher as Selvon and even reviewed by Selvon. As we make choices about who to read, who to write about, who to teach, who to anthologize, who to include in our bibliographies, who to purchase for our libraries, we're shaping the future of the literary past. And we also have the opportunity to refuse the narrow shaping of the prototype writer or the literary publisher, to expand that past and to recognize this other mid-century Caribbean in our histories to come. And if I've been thinking about how we lost the women, I think even more about how we might restore them. So for me, this is Monica's bibliography. So for me, this reparative work has to be about finding ways to bring their presence and works back that are accessible. As much as an academic, I do have to write those monographs that only 3.5 people read. It's not really what I want to do for them. So I have the website publication, which I think you saw earlier. And I wrote to Wikipedia. I've written Wikipedia entries for the writers so that people can find them. I'm trying to gather author files so that when people go into libraries and look for mid-century writers, they will find these women alongside the men. And I'm hoping to be able to work on developing some open educational resources so that they can be taught again in Caribbean schools and in schools here too, to expand that sense of literary history. But of course, I do still believe in books. I do still love books. And so maybe this is the book that I'm working on now. I particularly like books when they're affordable, beautiful, and by small independent presses based in the Caribbean, and when they contribute to bibliographical projects of including all the works of writers that we don't know, which I hope this one might do. Thank you very much.